Again, please grab your seats. We're about to get started. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, welcome. Wonderful to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here. We're getting started just on time. We have a very, very full and important and fascinating discussion. So we are up to lesson 4. And for those of you that are just joining us, what we've been doing during this course, is we have been exploring fascinating stories, short stories from our history. These are stories of what we call the unsung heroes, the people that are less well known when it comes to Jewish history. And this is the 4th and final lesson. Each week we've covered a different category. Lesson 1, we focused on converts. Lesson 2, we focused on Jewish leaders who influenced the greater Gentile world in an incredible way. Lesson 3, last week, we focused on 3 incredible Jewish women. And then finally tonight, we are going to explore 3 stories in our history that have to do with hostages and how Jewish communities dealt with the very, very difficult and painful question of hostages. And of course, the goal is that we're going to end with hopefully a discussion. Did someone take away the cone? Because I hear someone ringing the bell. Do you mind checking? Thank you so much. The code is supposed to be in the door over there. Okay, I just hear somebody ringing the bell. Thank you. Close that door. It might be popped open. We're still figuring out our new contraptions here. Okay, so hopefully we'll end with a discussion of what are some insights that we can derive. Thank you so much, Norbert. That we can derive in the current situation that the Jewish people are dealing with, especially in the land of Israel. So we're going to go from North Africa in the 10th century. That'll be our first story. Our second story will take place in Germany in the 13th century. And then finally, we'll go to Poland and Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, in the 17th century. Let's begin with what Judaism says about the very, very important mitzvah of redeeming captives. Okay, unfortunately, this is not a new phenomenon in Judaism. We've had this for many, many thousands of years. And it is codified in Jewish law based on the Talmud, how important it is to redeem captives. Let's look at text number 1 on page 145. This is from the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Again, this is found in many places. Page 145, text number 1. The redemption of captives takes priority over sustaining the poor and providing them with clothing. There is no greater mitzvah than redeeming captives. Which is interesting because we know in Judaism, what's the greatest mitzvah? What overrides everything else? Saving a life. So you're going to tell me redeeming captives overrides saving a life? This is a good question, right? Okay. So what we're going to see is that actually the reason why we have to redeem captives is because it includes saving life, among many other things. Okay. If we ignore the redemption of the captives, next paragraph, we transgress the following prohibitions. He gives us a whole list. You shall not harden your heart. You shall not shut your hand to the needy. You shall not stand by when your fellow's life is in danger, page 146. You shall not allow a worker to be oppressed ruthlessly, right? We're not allowed to watch other people be tortured. Furthermore, he says, in neglecting to redeem captives, we also negate the following proactive mitzvah. You shall surely open your hand to your needy fellow. Your brother shall live with you, meaning to take care of him. Love your neighbor as yourself. Rescue those taken for death, and many other similar statements. If we delay redeeming captives when it is possible to hasten, it is as if we are spilling blood in every added moment. So we have this oft quoted and correctly quoted idea that redeeming captives takes a very, very high level. It's at a very, very high pedestal in Jewish tradition. As we're going to see, there are some caveats which we'll hopefully get into. All right, let's jump straight into our stories. Let's explore the stories. So the first story we're going to focus on is a story that I actually referenced briefly during the Talmud course. So for the handful of you that were at the Talmud course, you may have heard the story before. It's not a super well-known story. It's also not a completely obscure story. For those that are slightly familiar with Jewish history, you may have heard the story. But what I'm going to share with you tonight is there are some discoveries that were made over the last 20 years that have changed the way we perceive the story, and scholars are having a fierce debate about some of the details of this story. Let's talk about where this story takes place, what we are dealing with over here. So we're going to go up on the screen. We're going to, okay, so we focused on all the different mitzvahs, all the different details. I'm just reviewing this up on the screen, all the different mitzvahs that we fulfill when we rescue those who were kidnapped, those who are hostages. Okay, so let's explore this mitzvah of redeeming captives. So we have the story. It's called the story of the four captives, the Arba Shvuyim. Let's explore a little bit, going back to the year 70. What happens in the year 70 of the Common Era? Temple is destroyed. Temple is destroyed, and as a result, Judaism evolves from being a temple-centered, a temple-oriented community and way of practice to a academic Torah study-oriented way of practice. Now, to be clear, there was plenty of Torah study beforehand, and there is plenty of worship taking place afterwards. But what I mean is, the center of Jewish life, of Jewish inspiration, migrated from the temple to the academies of higher learning. We know the famous story. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai requested and received permission from the Roman emperor to allow for there to continue a yeshiva, an academy of higher learning in Israel after the temple's destruction, which was an incredible thing. And in that time in Israel, the Jewish people managed to reestablish themselves. There was a new center of Jewish learning. It was initially in Israel. During that time, we have the Tanoim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, complete the composition of the Mishnah. And at the very same time, in a nearby country known as Babylonia, there is an exploration of the Mishnah taking place under the rulership or under the guidance of the Amirayim, the masters of the Talmud. Let's talk about this Babylonian community. When did Jews first end up in Babylonia, in Babel? When they were kicked out of Israel, when? After the destruction of the first temple. The Babylonians destroyed the temple. They exiled the Jews to Babylonia. Later, very quickly, it became Persia. That's where the Purim story happened. And actually, the Jews were under Babylonian occupation for a very short amount of time. They were for a much longer amount of time under Persian rule, and then eventually they came under Arab rule once there was the rise of the Muslims in the 7th century. Jews were in Babylonia from approximately the year 500 before the Common Era until 1956. Okay? But Babylonia was a center of Jewish life from approximately the year 300 until the year 1000. That was the golden age, so to speak, of Babylonian Jewry. From 300 to 1000, Babylonia is the center of Jewish life, of Judaism. If you wanted to learn, if you wanted to grow, that's where Jewish life was growing, was evolving. That's where inspiration came from. Jewish people who used to make a thrice annual pilgrimage to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem will now go to the academies in Babylonia in order to derive their holiday, their annual inspiration. After the development of the Talmud in approximately the year 500, the rabbis who lead the Babylonian Jewish community from 500 until 1000 are known as the Gaonim. And the Gaonim are corresponding with Jews all over the world. Now, all over the world at that point, mainly was Southern Europe, all over the Mediterranean, all around the Mediterranean, North Africa, Southern Europe, what is today Turkey, right? All of that is where Jews are found. As well, you go into the Far East, there were Jews there as well. And we have intact a tremendous amount of correspondence, halachic Jewish law correspondence between the rabbis of Babylonia, the way that literally from their yeshivas in Babylonia, they are guiding the entire Jewish world. After the year 1000, everything changes. The center of Jewish learning, the center of Jewish life no longer has a center. It gets broken up into many smaller communities. Now, again, there were communities already beforehand, but there was always a center. The center was first in Israel and then in Babylonia. Now, for the first time, there's no center. There are academies of higher learning in Southern Europe, in France, in Italy, in Spain, in North Africa, later in Turkey, and then, of course, in Eastern Europe later, in Poland, and all these countries, and they all have centers of Jewish learning. How and why did this transition take place? What happened to Bavel? What happened to Babylonia? Okay, now there were several factors that caused the changes to the Babylonian Jewish community. First of all, Babylonia itself was going through tremendous upheaval. We know about 200 years after the rise of the Muslims, there was a big struggle between where is the center of Muslim life. There were two caliphates. There was a caliphate in Baghdad. There was a caliphate in Constantinople. These are two opposing, warring kings who are trying to lead and be in charge of all the Muslims around the world. And the Babylonian caliphate was not managed very well. And as a result, economically, the country experienced a tremendous downturn. What always happens when a country experiences a tremendous downturn? Who becomes their scapegoat? The Jews. So, of course, they blame the Jews. There's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in Babylonia for the first time in many, many years. This is now in like the 9th century when this deterioration has taken place. And as a result, the Jews in Babylonia began to really, really struggle. Things were very tough. The economy was not good. The country was being mismanaged. And Jews slowly but surely set out to the new frontiers. They set out to live in communities in North Africa, in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia. Some even went as far as southern Spain, southern Italy, southern France. Poland gets its first Jewish community. Okay? They're slowly but surely starting to head out into the frontier. But still, the center of Judaism, this is around the year 850, 900, is still in Bavel, it's still in Babylonia. As Jews are heading out, they're always corresponding. They're sending their best students to go back to Bavel and to study and to learn and to come back inspired. And then things change. Something happens. What happens is the story of the four captives. Okay? What is the story of the four captives? So let me share with you that there is a big debate now. What exactly is the story? I'm going to share with you the classical story. I'll also share with you what some modern scholars argue is the story that they've started sharing about 20 years ago. And then we'll talk about, I'll share with you my opinion. You can talk about your opinion. It's an interesting debate that's going on right now. The reason why we're having this debate is you may recall in lesson 1, we talked about the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza is this treasure trove of hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that were found in Cairo in the 15th or 16th century. I'm sorry, much later. The Cairo Geniza was discovered at the end of the 1800s. Okay, the Cairo Geniza basically has letters, manuscripts, records of Jewish life from Cairo and from the Middle East from about the year 700 until the year 1400. What was a Geniza? A Geniza was a place where Jews would place sacred manuscripts that couldn't be thrown out or couldn't be burned. They would place them there and eventually they would bury them. And so they discovered this at the end of the 1800s, this treasure trove of incredible, incredible records and manuscripts and letters and teachings of Torah. And it's just an incredible work which continues to be explored. And as the technology gets better, there are manuscripts which are being uncovered even today. And there were some manuscripts that were uncovered related to this story about 20 years ago that caused some scholars to question certain details of the classic version of the story. So I'm just sharing that with you, okay? Not to get too much into the weeds, but to me, I think that's pretty cool that right now they're starting to argue over a story that happened over 1,000 years ago. Interesting concept. Okay. What is the classic version of the story? The classic version of the story is the Babylonian community is struggling financially because the economy has a downturn. The Jews at the new frontier are doing very well. And so the rabbis who lead the communities in Bavel, who lead the academies in Bavel, would travel to fundraise. They literally would get on a boat, they would go from city to city, town to town, and they would raise a lot of money, and they would bring it back in order to support the scholarship that was taking place in Babylonia. And on one of these trips, as they were traveling around the Mediterranean, and we're told exactly where they were traveling from, which city they were traveling from, they ended up in southern Italy. They raised money there. Then they're traveling across the Mediterranean. They're going to North Africa. And there is a group of pirates that sets upon them. These are pirates from Spain, Muslim pirates who were primarily capturing Christian ships. They set upon them, and these four rabbis are captured. And they are sold as, or they are ransomed by four different Jewish communities. One is in Egypt, one is in Libya, one is in southern Spain, and one is in southern France. These were four of the leaders of Judaism at the time. And now they're no longer in Babylonia. They're now in these four locations all around the Mediterranean. And suddenly, within a very short period of time, they're recognized by their communities, by the communities who redeemed them. They're appreciated for who they are. They open up their own academies. They have their own ability to have the authority. People are turning to them with questions instead of turning to Babylonia. People are sending their students to them locally instead of having them go on the dangerous trip all the way back to Bavel. And suddenly, the center of Jewish life has moved away from Babylonia. This happens over a couple of decades. Let's see the story inside. Text number 2, we'll read the classic version of the story. This is recorded by the same rabbi that we discovered in lesson 2. His name is Ra'avad. This is the same rabbi who told us the story of Menashe ben Yisrael in lesson 2. This is the same rabbi is the historian who's sharing this story. You'll see there's parts of this story that he has real personal knowledge of because his teacher was a student of one of these rabbis. So it's a real personal connection. Okay. Just an interesting little text over here that I want to refer you to before we get started. If you look on page 148, you have figure 4.1. This is an actual manuscript of a response that was sent by the rabbis in Babylonia. This is from the year 1005 in response to a question that was posed to them by a community in Southern Europe. It looks like a mezuzah, actually. It's interesting, right? But this is an actual, the original manuscript that we have preserved up until today. And this is found in a library somewhere in the world. Okay, this was sent, they were sending it to Europe. So this is from Babylonia to Europe. Let's turn to page 149 for the English translation of this text. It was brought about by God that the income of the yeshivot, which used to come from Spain, the land of Maghreb, Ifrica, Egypt, and the Holy Land, was discontinued. Meaning, which yeshivot are we talking about? Which yeshivot lost their income after this story? The ones in Babylonia, because they were no longer the center, right? The ones whose rabbis were kidnapped, they lost their income, okay? The following were the circumstances that brought this about. Ibn Rumahis, the commander of fleet, so he was part of the Spanish Navy. Southern Spain had a kingdom called Granada, whose capital was Cordoba. And he was a commander of the fleet, but on the side, he used to make a little extra money on the side, capturing people and selling them as slaves. That's what he did on the side. So, some people have a little drug business, a little side hustle. He would capture people and sell them as slaves. So it left Cordoba, having been sent by the Muslim king of Spain, Abd al-Rahmin and Nasir. This commander of a mighty fleet set out to capture the ships of the Christians and the towns that were close to the coast. They sailed as far as the coast of the land of Israel. Okay, so they go all the way around the Mediterranean. They go along the coast of Israel and swung about to the Greek Sea and the islands therein. Here they encountered a ship carrying 4 great scholars who were traveling from the city of Bari to a city called Sephastin, and who were on their way to a convention. There's going to be a gathering of rabbis, and these rabbis who are also fundraising are going to go join the convention. Ibn Rumachis captured the ship and took the sages prisoner. One of them was Rabbi Chushiel, the father of Rabbeinu Hananel. Another was Rabbi Moshe, the father of Rabbi Chanoich, who was taken prisoner with his wife and son. Rabbi Chanoich, who was then but a young lad. The third was Rabbi Shmaria ben Elchanan. As for the fourth, I do not know his name. So we know that there were four rabbis, but he says, I don't know the name of the fourth rabbi. Now, regarding who the fourth rabbi was, there's two theories. One is that he got mixed up. The fourth rabbi is the son of Reb Moshe. He says Reb Moshe was with his son. His son was a young boy. And that became the fourth rabbi, because we know that Moshe, the son of Chanoich, became a great rabbi in his own right. Another theory is that there's a rabbi, Rabbi Nathan, who around this time landed in southern France. And the feeling is that he was perhaps the fourth rabbi, and he was sold to the community in southern France. Okay, so they're captured by the pirates. The sages did not tell a soul about themselves or their wisdom. Why didn't they do that? Because the price would go up. Okay? Lesson, hostage negotiations 101. Do not tell your captors how valuable their hostages are. It's a bad idea. Don't make Saturday night demonstrations with 500,000 people, because then the price is just going to go up. I digress from politics, but I'm just mentioning that as an idea. Okay? The commander told Rabbi Shmaria, sold Rabbi Shmaria in Alexandria of Egypt. So they sold him in Egypt. Rabbi Shmaria proceeded to Fustat, where he became the head of the yeshiva. Fustat, I believe, is in Egypt. It's a city in Egypt. That's later where Maimonides lived. Okay. He then sold Rabbi Chushiel on the coast of Ifrica, North Africa. From there, the rabbi proceeded to the city of Kairouan, which was then the mightiest of all Muslim cities in the land of Maghreb, which today is Libya, where he became the head of the yeshiva, and where he begot his son, Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel was one of the earliest and most famous commentaries on the Talmud. The commander then arrived in Cordoba, where he sold Rabbi Moshe along with Rabbi Chanoch. In the ... over here, I'll just tell you what they're skipping, but I think it's important to share it. This wasn't all rainbows and roses. We were told earlier that Rabbi Moshe was there together with his son and his wife. The commander at this point informs the wife that she's staying with him as his wife. She's becoming the wife of the commander, right? Meaning the husband is being sold with his son to Cordoba, and she, this fine Jewish woman, is now becoming his wife, the pirate's wife. She immediately jumped off the boat, and she was never seen again. That's the story. Okay. This affair occurred in the days of Rabbi Sharira Gaon in about 990 of the Common Era, somewhat more or less. If you turn to the next page, so we have here a map. It's a little bit small, but you can see we have the Holy Land and Babylonia to the right of the Holy Land. We have Egypt. We have Ifrica, Maghreb, which is Libya and Morocco. We have Cordoba, which is southern Spain. We have Bari, which is where the ship was going from during that particular journey. And then we have the city of Kairouan, which is in the north of Africa. Okay? Here at the bottom, you have one of the letters that was discovered recently in the Cairo Geniza, which is a letter from one rabbi to another rabbi after they had already established themselves in their respective cities. This letter was deciphered maybe 20, 30 years ago. Okay, so remember, the rabbis did not disclose who they were. They were sold as Jews. Jews would be ransomed by very kind Jewish communities. Okay, now we don't have the exact minute-to-minute story what happened to each of these rabbis, but we do know what happened in Cordoba, because the person who's writing this account, he lives in Cordoba, and his teacher was a student of this rabbi, so he knows the story. He knows what happened. Here's the story. Here's how they were discovered. Okay, so let's examine the story of Rabbi Moshe. Rabbi Moshe, this is now page 153, was redeemed by the people of Cordoba, who were under the impression that he was a man of no education. Now in Cordoba, there was a synagogue that was called Knesset HaMidrash, the study gathering hall, where a judge by the name of Rabbi Natan the Pious, who was a man of distinction, used to preside. Rabbi Moshe was seated in the corner like an attendant, and he arose before Rabbi Natan and challenged an interpretation Rabbi Natan had given. He lifted up his hand and he asked a question. You know, the teacher is teaching something, and this newly redeemed slave is asking a question. When Rabbi Natan and the students heard Rabbi Moshe's words, they marveled to each other and asked him to explain the law to them. This he did quite properly. Then each of them posed to him all the difficulties that they had, and he replied to them with his abundant wisdom. Outside the study hall, there were litigants who were not permitted to enter until the students had completed their lesson. On that day, Rabbi Natan, the judge, walked out, and the litigants followed him. However, he said to them, I am no longer judge. This man who is dressed in rags and is a stranger is my master, and I shall be his disciple from this day on. You ought to appoint him judge of the community of Cordoba, and that is exactly what they did. The community then assigned Rabbi Moshe a large stipend and honored him with expensive garments and a carriage. Talk about a compensation package. At that point, the commander wished to retract his sale, right? So now the guy who sold him as a slave is like, hey, I got duped. I didn't realize how valuable you were. So he goes to the king, to his master, and he says, I want to cancel the sale. This man should be my slave once again. However, the king would not permit him to do so, for he was delighted by the fact that the Jews of his domain no longer needed the people of Babylonia. The king himself is excited that the Jews can now be independent and not reliant upon other countries. The report of all this spread throughout the land of Spain and the Maghreb, and the students came to study under Rabbi Moshe. Moreover, all questions which had formerly been addressed to the academies of Babylonia were now directed to him. The communities of West and East did not resume the sending of gifts to the academies in Babylonia because these scholars raised many disciples and the knowledge of the Talmud spread throughout the world. So this was to the benefit of the respective communities that they came to, but it was to the detriment of Babylonia. And it further hastened the demise of the centrality of the Babylonian communities. Again, Jews remained in Babylonia, in Iraq, until the 1950s. But the prominence of the community descended very quickly from this point forward. Okay, so this is the classic version of this incredible story. Now, I will just share with you, there are some modern scholars who, based on a few things, posit that perhaps these rabbis were not from Babylonia. Rather, they were together in Italy, in southern Italy. Again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but some of you might appreciate this. Okay, if you get lost, it's okay. Most Jews spread from Babylonia all over the world. But there were also Jews who went directly from Israel to different parts of the world. Primarily the Jews who were exiled from Eretz Yisrael and who kept the connection to Eretz Yisrael, not relying on Babel. They had like this opinion that we don't have to rely on Babylonia. We have a direct connection with Israel. They were in southern Italy. Even today, the communities of Rome have customs that are different than all the other communities in the world. They're not Sephardi customs. They're not Ashkenazi customs. They are customs of Rome. Okay? They claim that their customs go back directly to the land of Israel. So they had a certain pride. We don't need Babylonia in order to know what to do. Okay? So unlike all the other communities, the rabbis in Italy were not relying on Babylonia for their support. So what causes the downfall of Babylonia? When 4 of these rabbis are forced out of Italy and they spread all over what was then the Jewish world. So now this attitude of we don't need Babylonia now spreads to southern France, and it spreads to southern Spain, and it spreads to Egypt, and it spreads to North Africa, and this indirectly hurts Babylonia. Now, why do these scholars say this? They say this for 2 reasons. Number one, the text does clearly say they left the city in Italy. It doesn't say anything about them leaving Babylonia. But also in manuscripts that were recently discovered, Rabbi Hushiel proudly writes, I am from Italy. He doesn't say, I am from Babylonia and I was sold to southern Italy. He says, I'm from Italy. I'm proud of it. Right? Now, I would argue that that's not necessarily a proof. If a community goes and saves you and pays good money and ransoms you, you're going to respect them by saying, I'm from this community. It doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't previously in Babylonia. All right? There's also other arguments that are made that they didn't have such a connection to the Babylonian customs. They had more of a connection to the Israel customs. Again, there are many different, there's a whole debate back and forth between the scholars. But bottom line, okay, the classical story is the story that I told you earlier. They were fundraising for the academies in Babylonia, and they ended up spreading throughout the nation. So what do we see, bottom line? What we see is, on the one hand, a horrific story. A story of kidnapping, a story of captives, a story of a woman who had to commit suicide in order to save her honor and dignity. It's a terrible story. It's a horrific story. But at the same time, we see the hand of Hashem, the hand of providence, that as Babylonia is going through its own challenges, the economy is having its downfall, the Muslim kings are killing each other, and we know that eventually the Iraqi caliphate descended, and it was the Constantinople Caliphate that rose to prominence. Had the center of Jewish life remained there, it's very possible that there would have been, slowly but surely, would have petered out, and the other communities would have really suffered spiritually. So in a way, what happened here was sort of, a terrible thing, obviously, but it was Hashem arranging things in such a way to protect the Jewish people. Let's look at text number 4, where this is expressed in a beautiful way. Text number 4. As the sun set on the yeshivot of Sura and Pumbedita in Babylonia, those are the two main academies, the world was desolate, and it seemed that the Torah was set to be forgotten. But then precisely at this critical time, the Torah spread to all corners of the earth, reaching as far as Egypt and Africa, Spain and France. God left us a remnant for captives. Divine providence arranged that these men be taken captive and sold as slaves in the four corners of the world, in order to spread Torah even to distant lands. Anyone who looks with open eyes will see that this jug of oil, the Torah, has not yet emptied. He's referring to like the Hanukkah story, right? For this miracle continues to repeat itself in our days. Just as the Jewish people are eternal, so is this jug of oil eternal. Moreover, the eternity of the Torah is the root of the eternity of the Jewish people. Okay? So this, my friends, is story number 1. This is the story of the 4 captives. All right, story number 2, which as you're going to see is a very, very different story, takes place in Germany in the 13th century. There's a city called Worms in German, or Wurmeise in rabbinic literature, Worms, okay? There was a man who was born in approximately the year 1220, to a very prominent rabbinic family. He was named by his parents, he was named Meir. And after about 15, 20 years of life, he picked up and he traveled to France. What was happening in France during that time? France at that time was the center of the study of the Talmud and the creation of a project that is known today as the Tosophists, or Tosafot. If you look at a page of Talmud, the page of Talmud has the text in the middle. On the inside of the page, you have the commentary of Rashi, who was a great rabbi from southern France. On the outside of the page, you have the commentary of the Tosophists, who are a collection of rabbis, many of whom were actually grandchildren and descendants of Rashi. And they wrote a commentary, very often arguing with their grandfather or discussing different elements of the Talmud, asking questions, contradictions. This is the incredible project known as the Tosophists. So it was an exciting place to be if you were very into Torah study. So this great man, this Rabbi Meir, at the age of 15, he picks up and he travels to Paris, and there he is studying under the Tosophists in France. He was actually there in France when the horrific events of 1240 to 1242 took place, which was the trial and the eventual destruction of every single copy of the Talmud in the entire kingdom. We actually learned about this in the opening lesson of our Talmud class, where literally the nations of the world felt tremendously threatened by the Talmud. They put the Talmud on trial, and they had thousands of copies. These are handwritten copies. There was no printing press in 1240. Thousands upon thousands of precious handwritten volumes were burned at the stake in this horrific event. Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg. Later, he was known as Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg. He was witness to this terrible event. He wrote what's known as a kina. A kina is like a mournful poem that is read on the day of Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the day that Jews recall the destruction of our people with the two temples and all the different persecutions that happened. So one of the famous kinot, if you come to Shul on Tisha B'Av, you read kinot. One of the famous kinot is written by Rabbi Meir after he witnessed the burning of the Talmud. Okay, so he saw up front and personal the tremendous anti-Semitism that was brewing against the Jewish people. A few decades later, we don't know exactly when, he makes his way back to Germany. It is believed that his father was sick. His father was the head rabbi of Worms, and his father sent word that he wants his son to be his successor. And so, as a tremendously accomplished scholar, he travels back and he succeeds his father as the head rabbi of the city of Worms. But very quickly, he goes from being the head rabbi of Worms to the head rabbi of the entire country of Germany, and eventually to the head rabbi of all of Ashkenazic Jewry. He becomes the recognized Gadol Hadar, the leader of the generation to whom all the communities from all over the Ashkenazic world were turned to with questions to clarify things, clarify the different customs and the different texts and the different practices and things that came up. And we have extant. We have many, many hundreds of letters that went back and forth from the leaders of various communities all over Europe, sending questions to this one address to Rabbi Meir, the leader of the Ashkenazic Jewry who lived in the city of Worms. Let's watch a little video, and then we'll get to the rest of the story. We'll jump ahead over here. Okay. Oops, there we go.
We don't have an exact year of birth for Meir of Rothenburg, which is very common in the medieval period. There were no birth certificates or other certificates. We believe he was born somewhere between 1215 and 1220 something. He was originally from Worms in the Rhineland, and that's where he's buried to this day, because there were not a lot of great scholars left in Germany at that particular time. Meir of Rothenburg went to France. He went to northern France, where he studied with a series of very important Tosophists, those who commented on the Talmud and on Rashi's commentary to the Talmud. That started in the mid-12th century. He got there somewhere, we know when he was there, he got there somewhere around 1230 or 40, again, depending on when he was born. And his most important teacher there was someone named Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. And that's important for a number of reasons, aside from Rabbi Yechiel being a great Torah scholar. Meir of Rothenburg was apparently in Paris when the Talmud was burned in the year 1242. That was the result of the so-called trial of the Talmud in 1240. Not that it was all disaster. There were plenty of good Torah study. And in that respect, Meir of Rothenburg took in this French Tosophist method of study of comparing texts and resolving texts. And Rothenburg was not his original hometown. Rothenburg was in south central Germany. He seems to have gone there once he came back from northern France. Maharam very quickly becomes the Gadol Hador, the leading Torah scholar of his generation. Again, not just because there weren't many others, but he really distinguished himself. Already in the 1240s, the trial of the Talmud, which Maharam witnessed, that's the 1240s. As we move forward, the Jews in northern France are under tremendous economic pressure, meaning money is owed to them, debts are canceled, so their livelihoods are basically threatened to the core. There are physical persecutions, there are attempts at conversion. Again, the rulers, some of them try to provide some security, servi camerai, serfs of the chamber. The king will protect the Jews, but these protections, and France and Germany are a little different here, but these protections don't always hold up. And many of the questions that Maharam received were questions about things that happened during conversionary efforts. So again, on the basis of all the earlier persecutions, Maharam was not, in that sense, jumping ship. It was pikuach nefesh. Maharam believed that his life was...
Break here for a second, and I'll narrate the rest of the story, and then we'll watch the rest of the video. Okay, so he comes back to Germany, And Germany was very much affected by the anti-Semitism that had plagued France. Meaning Germany and France are neighbors. Obviously, if they're burning Talmud in France, the Germans are also getting a little riled up. This wasn't the first time that Germany was a dangerous place for Jews. We know that during the Crusades, there were many German communities that were massacred by the Crusaders. This particular case, something which the local rulers did in order to quote unquote protect the Jews, was they made the Jews their property. The Jews became serfs of the local nobility, and that was supposed to afford them protection. But as we're going to see, when you become a serf of a ruler, you're also owned by the ruler, and you can only do things with their permission. So that eventually does create some trouble. Things became more and more difficult, and at some point, we don't know exactly why, but Maharam, Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg, decided to pick up and flee. And he tried to go, we believe he was going to make Aliyah to go to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, in order to live out his life there. The details of the story were actually discovered in a very interesting way. In the year 1615, which is about 50 years after these events took place, not 50 years, 30, 35, 40 years after these events took place, there was an uprising of the Christians in the city of Worms. During the uprising, the Jews were expelled. The synagogue was destroyed. A few years later, the Christian uprising was crushed. The Jews were welcomed back in. And as they were getting ready to rebuild their synagogue, they discovered a manuscript which had 500 years of Jewish history in the city of Worms, including and concluding with the story in detail of how the head rabbi of Germany tried to escape. And that's how we know these details that we're going to read over here. Okay? What happens? So let's look at text number 5. We have in detail from that manuscript that was discovered in the ruins of the shul of exactly what happened. This is called Minhagot Vermaisa, the customs and the story of the city of Worms. Page 158, text number 5. Our teacher, Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg, son of Rabbi Baruch of blessed memory, set out on a journey to cross the sea along with his household, daughters, son-in-law, and all his possessions. He arrived at a city situated among the high mountains known as Lombard Alps in German. He intended to stay there until all of those traveling with him would gather there. Suddenly, the wicked bishop of Basel rode down from Rome through that city. Together with him was a wicked Jewish apostate named Kneppe. We see this throughout these stories, how the Jewish apostates were the worst. They were the most hateful towards the Jews. Kneppe recognized our teacher, right? He was traveling incognito, trying to hide his identity. Now, by the way, why was he escaping? Why was it a problem for him to leave? The answer is he was a serf. The Jews were owned by the king. You couldn't leave without the king's permission. And the king would not give him permission to leave because he was the leader of the Jewish community. This would cause a lot of Jews to leave. They would lose taxes and whatever other benefits they got from Jews. Kneppe recognized our teacher and informed, page 159, the bishop. This caused Count Meinhard of Gorizia and the lord of that city to arrest him on the 4th day of Tammuz in the year 46 of the 6th millennium, which is 1286 of the Common Era, and hand him over to King Rudolph. Okay? King Rudolph puts forth a decree on December 6, 1286. All the Jews who were fleeing have violated the law because they are the property of the king. They are to be arrested. Their property is to be confiscated and donated to the government. Most of the Jews were eventually released on condition that they don't leave. Rabbi Meir was held. Initially, he was tortured to try to find out who had orchestrated things, who had organized things, who had paid for things. He was tortured because he refused to speak, and he was held for ransom. The king said, you want him back? You're going to have to pay for it. The Jews started raising money. This wasn't a new thing. Of course, we're going to raise money. For the leader of the entire Jewish people, we're going to raise money. But at this point, he put down his foot and he said, no, you're not going to ransom me. I'm going to stay in prison. What was his argument? His argument was a section of the Talmud. The Talmud tells us, when it talks about the virtue of ransoming captives, of redeeming captives, let's look at text number 6. We have the quote from the Talmud. For the sake of society at large, captives are not redeemed for more than their actual monetary value. The reason for this is so that the captors will not seize additional captives. So we don't redeem someone for more than their market value. Now, what does it mean, market value? In those days, people had a market value. There was a slave market, and there was a market value. So if they're asking for the normal price, it's okay to redeem them. It's a mitzvah to redeem them. But if this person is considered very valuable and they're asking for a ridiculous price, it's not allowed, says the Talmud. Two reasons are given for it not being allowed in the discussions about this. One reason is that it's going to incentivize further kidnapping. If you make it too valuable, they're just going to kidnap again and again and again. And furthermore, it's going to eventually impoverish the community and they won't be able to live anymore because they're going to use all their money redeeming captives. Okay? So let's look at text number 7, where we see the reasoning spelled out. This is one of the commentaries on that section of the Talmud. Text number 7. I heard about Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg, who was imprisoned in the fortress of Ensisheim for several years, and the ruler demanded a large sum from the communities for his release. The communities wished to ransom Rabbi Meir, but he refused, arguing that captives should not be redeemed for more than their worth. His reasoning must have been that if the communities would ransom him, it may incentivize other rulers to do the same and other prominent Torah scholars hostage for exorbitant ransoms. Eventually, the wealth of the entire Jewish people would not suffice to ransom them, and the Torah would be forgotten among the Jewish people. Here is the proof that he was right. This is very interesting. After this case, the rulers stopped seizing sages and holding them for ransom. Okay? So what happened? What happened was he put out a decree, no one should ransom him. He ended up remaining in prison for 7 years. And after 7 years, he died. The Jews came and they requested his body for burial, and the king said, no, you're going to have to ransom him. And his body remained imprisoned for an additional 14 years. Oh. So a total of 21 years he was in prison. Now, although initially his imprisonment was very, very difficult, he was tortured, but eventually he was being held not so much to torture him, but more to force the community to give the ransom. And we know that there were negotiations going on until the very end. In fact, there's a manuscript that was discovered recently that shows that an agreement was reached. An agreement was reached for how much the community was going to pay in order to ransom him. I guess it was considered a reasonable price, and it wouldn't go against it wouldn't violate his wishes. But then he died, and the community said, well, now that he passed away, the value has gone down. We have to renegotiate. And those negotiations took another 14 years. Okay, let's look at text number 8. He wrote manuscripts and letters and continued teaching Torah from prison. But he was a very broken man. It was a very, very difficult circumstance. Text number 8. He writes over here, when I am released to safety, this is from his letters, I will gladly ensure that you receive a copy of my commentary to the sections of the Mishnah, Zerayim, and Taharot. During my imprisonment, I have not forgotten my Creator, and I have remained devoted to his Torah and to fear of heaven. From, and he signs as follows, the soul obedient to your command, the impoverished, the individual forgotten of all goodness, the downtrodden doormat, once known as Meir, the son of Rabbi Baruch of blessed memory. Wow. So this is the way he lived the end of his life. Eventually, in the year 1307, 14 years after he passed away, he was ransomed by a Jew by the name of Alexander Wimpin. And they're actually buried next to each other in the city of Worms. You can actually see a photograph of their grave site, the way it looks today. You can see it there on page 164. These two people are buried next to each other. And we can actually read the inscription. Text 9a, this monument is for our master and teacher, Rabbi Meir, the son of Rabbi Baruch. He was captured by the king of the Roman Empire on the 4th day of Tammuz in the year 1286. He passed away in captivity in the year 1293. He was not given a proper burial until 1307. This is what his inscription says. And then on page 165, you have the inscription of the individual who had the merit to redeem Rabbi Meir from captivity. There's an interesting story that's told that this fellow, this Alexander Wimpin, who redeemed him from captivity, he actually died a few days later. He died a few days later, and everybody was shocked. Such a tzaddik, such a holy person. He goes and does such a big mitzvah. He redeems the rabbi, and then he dies. But a few days later, after he was buried next to the rabbi, he came to one of the great sages in a dream. And he said to him that after I ransomed Rabbi Meir and he was buried, Rabbi Meir came to me in a dream and offered me a reward. He said, I want to either give you a long life and wealth for you and for all your descendants. That's one option. Another option is that you can join me in my place in the heavenly spheres. You can come and be next to me in Gan Eden. And he says, I immediately chose to be with him in Gan Eden. And he says, and I said to him, and I'd like to go right away. And so he says, and therefore, a couple of days later, he died. And he says, I'm very happy in my place next to Rabbi Meir in Gan Eden. So that is an interesting story that's told regarding the story of Rabbi Meir. Let's look at the rest of the video, and then we'll summarize the story.
In danger. Whether he knew somehow that he might be captured or something else is purely speculative, but in any case, Maharam he leaves Germany. Apparently, Maharam was on the way to Israel. What we know for sure is that he moves eastward. He's in Germany, which is sort of the center of the Holy Roman Empire. As you move southeast, you get to Italy, right? The Alps, however you cross, however you go around. And apparently in 1286, we have some contemporary documentation, Maharam, he apparently had stopped there to wait for others to come with him to follow. And Maharam was captured by agents of the Holy Roman Emperor, by agents of the King of Germany, who also had control of this area of Italy. Again, there are suggestions that somebody informed on Maharam or informed them that Maharam, again, great scholars had to travel incognito. You can ask the question, is this mainly anti-Semitism? Is this mainly economic? Is this mainly political? And the answer to that question is yes, all of the above. They were looking for the economic benefits. They were looking for the anti-Jewish benefits. They were looking for the political benefits, showing who's in charge. In any case, Maharam at that point is captured, and he is brought back by the Holy Roman Emperor to Germany, where he is put in at least one or two, maybe more, quote-unquote fortresses. These are not prisons in the Rikers Island sense, if I can say that. These are not prisons where you're treated horribly. He's a political prisoner. He's an economic prisoner. In other words, the capture was done so that the Jews would pay large sums of money to try to get Maharam out.
Just to summarize the entire story, this is where he's born. He goes to France to study with the great scholars, the Tosophists. He witnesses the burning of the Talmud. He returns to Germany and becomes a leading rabbinic authority. As the danger increases, he tries to flee. He's in northern Italy, and there he is discovered and handed over to King Rudolph. But he halted his own ransom payment because he said it is a ridiculous amount. And he argued, if we pay this price now, they will seize more and more captives, demanding ever higher ransoms for their freedom. Okay, we talked about how is the actual value measured. He remained in prison for 7 years, continued to teach Torah. His body was held in captivity for another 14 years until he was redeemed by a benefactor. So this is a person who, of course, the community was ready to redeem him, but he decided to draw the line in the sand and to say, I'm going to put my people and the welfare of the Jewish people ahead of my own welfare. And he sort of made a very, very powerful statement. As we see, according to at least the text that we read earlier, the frequency of kidnappings decreased after the relative failure of this particular episode. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our second story. Our third story takes us to Poland. Poland in the mid-17th century. Let's talk a little bit about the history of Jews in Poland. Okay, Poland becomes an empire in the 11th century. And for almost the entire time of the next 10 centuries of the Polish country or the Polish Empire, Jews are, relatively speaking, treated much better than they're treated in other countries in Europe. Now, I emphasize the term relatively speaking, okay? They're not treated well, but compared to how Jews are treated in Spain and Portugal and France and England and Germany, right? Jews are, relatively speaking, treated pretty well in Poland. There are two horrific and very, very famous exceptions to this. And they are, of course, the Holocaust, which is the worst. We know that there were 3 million Jews in Poland at the start of the Second World War, and 90% of them were wiped out by the Nazis. It was a horrific, horrific event that happened to Polish Jewry. But before the Holocaust, the worst event that happened to the Jewish people from the time of the temple until the Holocaust were the events of 1648 and 1649, known by their Hebrew acronym, the acronym of the Hebrew year, Tafchet and Taftet, Tachvetat, also known as the massacres of Khmelnytsky. Khmelnytsky was the Ukrainian Cossack who led the rebellion and the massacre of all these, what is estimated to be as many as 100,000 Jews who were killed during this time. Okay? But in general, the Polish Empire was unique in how welcoming it was to Jews. The Jews used to often talk about that the word Poland, which is Hebrew for Poland, means in Hebrew, Polin. Polin means here we're going to rest. Here we can finally take a breather. Here we can relax. Here we're treated well. Okay? And so, at various times, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire encompasses, of course, Poland, parts of Hungary, the Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarusia. Large parts of Eastern Europe are under this Polish Empire. And as Jews are expelled from England and from France, and Jews are persecuted in the rest of the German Empire, and even some Jews from Spain and Portugal, they end up making their way to this relatively welcoming country of Poland. By 1550, it is believed that 75% of the world's Jews lived in the Polish Empire. And it's about 100 years later where absolute disaster takes place. In the year 1648, the Polish Empire encompasses, generally speaking, Poland, Lithuania, and what is today Ukraine. And there was a large concentration of Jews in Ukraine in general, and in southern Ukraine in particular. Now, we know that the peasants of Ukraine were persecuted by the Polish nobility. They were horrifically mistreated. They were used and abused. And often Jews who lived locally were used by the nobility. The Polish nobility would use Jews as managers of their property. So let's say you had some Polish noble who lives in Warsaw, owns massive pieces of land in Ukraine. He hires a Jew, his Moshe or his Ruvain, to manage that property. And who's working on that property? Who's slaving on that property? Who's suffering on that property? Who's wasting all of their kopecks on getting drunk every night in a tavern that's run by a Jew? It's a Jewish person, right? And it's the Ukrainian peasants who are seeing themselves suffering under the Polish nobility, and it's often the Jews who are the direct object of their suffering. And so as a result, there was a lot of negativity towards Jews. There was a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. Again, the scapegoat, right? What can they do to the nobles, right? But they can hate the Jews. The Jews are the ones who are hurting them. Furthermore, if they needed a loan, it was against the law in Christian lands to lend money with interest. But Jews were allowed to lend money with interest to non-Jews, so the Jews would give loans, and then the interest would grow, and these drunken peasants would get very frustrated. And so instead of paying back the Jew, you just kill the Jew, right? So there was a lot of this going on during that time. Now, furthermore, to the south of Ukraine, there's a little area that you may have heard of on the news. What's it called? Crimea. Crimea was Muslim at the time. Crimea was occupied by a band, by a tribe, or by a group of people known as the Tartars. The Tartars ran Crimea. The Tartars were the ones who ran the massive Ottoman slave trade. There was a slave trade in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a very large, successful empire. They needed many, many slaves. They would bring slaves from these Christian peasants who lived in the Ukraine. How did they get them? The Tartars would come in and they would kidnap people. And they would bring them back to the Ottoman Empire and they would sell them as slaves. About 10,000 people a year were kidnapped and brought as slaves into the Ottoman Empire. It was the second largest slave trade in the world at the time. What was the largest? The Atlantic slave trade. Okay, that was the largest one. This is the second largest one. Now, the Polish nobility did not want the Tartars coming in and taking slaves. So they paid a group of mercenaries who lived in southern Ukraine. They were peasants, but they were a little bit more sophisticated peasants. They were known as Cossacks. They paid the Cossacks to keep the Tartars out of Ukraine. Okay, so you have Cossacks inside Ukraine on the southern border. You have Tartars in Crimea. Tartars are always trying to come into Ukraine in order to capture slaves that they can sell to the Ottoman Empire. And the Polish nobility are paying the Cossacks to fight the Tartars. Sometimes the Polish nobility would also pay the Tartars to stay out of Ukraine. It's like paying Hamas to stay out of your country, right? Okay, this is what's going on. In 1648, one of the Cossacks decided, instead of us working so hard, fighting the Tartars, losing our lives, losing everything, why don't we join forces with the Tartars? We'll make an alliance with them, and we'll overthrow the Polish nobility, and Ukraine will be ours. And the Tartars can have as many slaves as they want, and we'll split the profits. This is exactly what they did. Now, of course, they're not going to attack fellow Christian brethren. So who are they going to attack and enslave? The Jews. And there is a horrific event that takes place between the years 1648 and 1649. These two groups get together and they go across the southern Ukrainian countryside, literally city to city, town to town. Older Jews, weaker Jews are slaughtered by the Cossacks. Younger Jews, healthier Jews are captured and brought as slaves by the Tartars. And this is an absolutely horrific event that is taking place during that time. Okay, so we have, this operation is run by a man whose name is Bogdan Khmelnytsky. He riled up all the peasants who were Christians, and for them it was a religious war. We're going to force the Jews to convert, or they're going to be massacred. Close to 100,000 Jews were killed. And of course, the Tartars are going to kidnap as many as they can and sell them as slaves in the Ottoman Empire. And the uprising was successful. The Polish nobility were not looking to risk their armies and their soldiers. They just let Ukraine go. And Ukraine comes under the control of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And until today, he's considered a hero in the Ukraine as the one who liberated Ukraine from the Polish Empire. Today, you go to some cities in Ukraine, there are statues to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the liberator of Ukraine, a man who slaughtered 100,000 Jews. Okay? There are accounts of what happened. How these armies would come in, slaughter, rape, pillage, and then, of course, kidnap and take into slavery. Think of what happened October 7th times 100. That's what happened during this six-month period in the years 1648 and 1649. There are many books that are written. Let's read a little snippet from text 10. Text 10, page 167. Who can recount all our troubles? If all the seas were ink and the reeds quills, they would not suffice to write all our afflictions. Who can recount how the Tatars entered the region of Volhynia and burned all our properties along with our synagogues and Torah scrolls and killed all the righteous who were our crowns? Now you, God, Lord of our fathers, look down and hear our cry. Seek redemption for our exile. Walk amidst our camps. Reveal the end of days when we will be cleansed. God, return our captives. Okay? Now, what was the aftermath of this event? What did this do to the Jewish community? So first of all, many Jews were killed. Many Jews were sold into slavery. The Jews were impoverished. They lost their source of income, which was very often working for the Polish nobility. Furthermore, any Jews who worked on the land, Jews were afraid to remain in the small villages because in the large cities, the Polish nobility had armies that protected the Jews. It was the Jews in the small villages who were murdered. So all the Jews flocked to the large cities, but the large cities didn't have ways of supporting all these Jews. So you ended up with these large urban centers with Jews who were horrifically impoverished. It was a very, very difficult time for the Jewish people. And it was into this moment where a shyster by the name of Shabtai Tzvi showed up, took advantage of the suffering of the Jewish people, proclaimed himself as the Messiah coming to redeem the Jewish people. This was in the 1660s, so about 15 years later. And because of how desperate people were, and because of how charismatic this Shabtai Tzvi was, people followed him, people believed in him, people gave up their last pennies to support him, and he ended up being a false Messiah who ends up in the Ottoman Empire. He ends up converting to Islam, and again, it dashes the hopes and the dreams and the desires of the Jewish people are crashed to the ground. And it was into this very, very, very difficult time for the Jewish people, difficult time materially, emotionally, and spiritually, that in the late 1600s, early 1700s, a new movement begins to develop in Eastern Europe, which brings joy and light and passion and energy to the Jewish people. This is the birth, of course, of the Baal Shem Tov and the movement of Hasidus, which came specifically in the wake of these horrific events. That's just a little bit of the history of what happened following this massacre. Usually when people talk about this story, they focus on the massacre and the aftermath. What we're going to focus on today is what happened to all those slaves. The estimates are that 10,000 Jews were kidnapped during these events and were brought to be sold as slaves in the Ottoman Empire. Think about it for a second. For years, the Tartars had a slave trade. They would capture about 10,000 people a year. A tiny, tiny percentage of them were Jews. Of course, if any Jews showed up in Istanbul, the community would gladly rescue them, would ransom them, would help them with open arms. But what happens now when 10,000 people show up in the course of a few months? It was an overwhelming situation that the people of the Ottoman Empire were dealing with. Now, thankfully, the Jews in the Ottoman Empire were doing well. They were comfortable. There had been some incredible stories in their history. We know that about 100 years earlier, there was Donna Grazia Nassi, who came and helped that community and invested in that community. And so they were a well-established community. They had the ability to help a few captives. But when it comes to thousands and thousands upon thousands of people, it becomes an overwhelming circumstance. Furthermore, if you think about it, when the captives from Spain, not the captives, when the refugees were escaping from Spain that we talked about last week, the refugees from Spain were Sephardim. The Jews in the Ottoman Empire were Sephardim. They looked the same. They had dark skin. They sounded the same. Their food was similar. They spoke the same language. The Jewish language was Ladino in these Sephardic countries. Here you have a bunch of Yiddish-speaking Ukrainian Jews showing up in a Sephardic community. And these are Sephardic communities that probably have never seen an Ashkenazi Jew. You give them a piece of gefilte fish, they're going to throw you out of the house, right? And yet what happens? We're going to see, incredibly, this community came together and gave their last penny in order to help their fellow Jew, just because they're a fellow Jew. No other connection, just because they're a fellow Jew. It's really, really an amazing story. Let's just explore a little bit through the eyes of one individual who was taken captive together with his son and daughter from Ukraine. Text number 11, this is the story of Rabbi Yaakov Margolis. This is page 168. The vicissitudes of time have carried me away. The evil decree that has befallen us in the land of Poland. We received the results of heaven's decrees for us, those destined for the sword to the sword, those destined for starvation to starvation, and those destined for captivity to captivity. He's quoting Jeremiah. The verse lists the fates in a progressive order of severity. For captivity includes all of the previously mentioned sufferings. I was among the exiles taken captive with my son and daughter. We were led into exile in iron chains. My feet were bound in chains. They drove me and my children away from my family, from my father's house and from my homeland to a foreign land. I have been banished from the inheritance of the holy ones. I said in my heart amidst my tears, who is with me? Who will be my tower of strength? Who in the heavens will spread his hands to take me, to draw me from the raging waters? Who do I have on foreign soil who will give me refuge and shelter? Who will stand by me and help me like a friend or be like a brother to me? So obviously he wasn't just expecting people in faraway Istanbul to step up and to help him. Okay? And then he tells us the incredible greeting and the incredible rescue that took place, how the community in Turkey, in Constantinople, in Istanbul, how they came together, giving of their last pennies in order to help their poor brethren. Text number 12. God granted me mercy at the hands of the virtuous people, the noble men of the land who are generous, righteous, and pious people, descendants of saintly ancestors, compassionate folk who are authentic descendants of the compassionate nation, the members of the holy Jewish community of Constantinople. Most prominent among them were the perfect sages who study Torah day and night and who perform acts of kindness with the children of Israel who are being held by harsh masters. These people redeem me. May their homes be peaceful. May there be peace in their bastions and live forevermore. Now, his story, although he was redeemed, he lost his children because his children were sold into slavery to non-Jews before he was redeemed by the Jewish community. And he writes in his book how he spent the rest of his life trying to find his children. He actually raised money. He begged for money. He put a little bit of money together. And at one point, he thought he found his daughter. He thought he found his daughter. And he collected money from kind people. He said, I have the opportunity to go and to rescue my daughter. But turns out when he arrived and he saw who he thought was his daughter, it was a mistake. It was another Jewish girl that had been kidnapped and was living as a slave in the home of a Gentile. And he decided not to rescue her because he wanted to hold on to the money that he had in case he finds his daughter. But the community, the Jewish community in that town, wherever it was, they took him to rabbinical court. And they said to him, you committed to rescuing this girl. You raised money that you're going to rescue someone. You have to use the money that you promised to unite. And it was a whole discussion. There's manuscripts back and forth, different rabbis with different opinions, whether he's obligated to use the money that he had raised to rescue the girl, even though it wasn't his daughter. These are the kind of horrific circumstances that people were dealing with during that time. Bottom line, what do we see? We see incredible kindness and generosity of the Jews of Istanbul and Constantinople. It's described how the women literally would show up, take the jewelry off their hands, take the extra clothing off their backs, and give it away in order to be sold, in order to rescue more and more people. Obviously, it was a very, very difficult circumstance. And as they would rescue people, more would show up, and more waves of slaves would show up, eventually numbering 10,000. And it became too difficult for them to handle on their own. And so they turned this successfully into an international effort of Jews all over the world, raising money, giving money in order to rescue this community who had suffered so much. We have a number of very, very interesting documents. We have a document of Rabbi Yaakov and Yosef Abob, who are two rabbis from the city of Venice in Italy. It's quite the distance from Venice to Constantinople. Okay, these rabbis in Venice are sending out letters of appeal all over Europe, trying to raise money in order to help the Jews from Ukraine who are being sold as slaves in Constantinople. We also find a familiar name, Menashe ben Yisrael. Menashe ben Yisrael, who lives in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. He's also a big community activist, and he's getting involved in this effort in order to help raise money and to save the Jews who were being sold as slaves. You may recall Menashe ben Yisrael, second lesson. Menashe ben Yisrael was the one who influenced Cromwell to allow the Jews to come back to England. He wrote a book trying to convince him why the Jews need to be allowed back into England. And one of his arguments was, look at what happened to the Jews in Ukraine. They were massacred. They were sold as slaves. We're trying to raise money for them. You have to let them go back to England. England is a good place. England should take the Jews back. He uses this story as an argument for why England should allow the Jews to come back. We have here a very interesting letter which hints to us how much money was spent. According to this letter, if you do the math, they were spending several $100,000 per captive in today's money in order to rescue them. The equivalent of $300,000-$400,000 per person, and they end up rescuing 6,000 people in the course of 10 years. We're talking about a massive international effort, Jews around the world banding together in order to save a community from the Ukraine. It's an amazing story. Text number 13. Text number 13 on page 172. These two rabbis are writing their appeal letter to try to raise money. We address ourselves to the two commanders of Israel's army, distinguished in mitzvahs and good deeds, renowned and praised individuals, unique in their excellence, the illustrious Rabbi Zanvil Haz and the illustrious Rabbi Ber Oppenheim. May they live with strength and peace. These are two philanthropists from Germany. Our souls grieved as we heard cries for help coming from our brethren abducted from distant lands in the renowned city of Constantinople. The poor oppressed captives from Poland are groaning in need as load after load arrives in Constantinople, strained and distraught. The Constantinople community is unable to continue paying for their ransom because their kindness and righteousness have already reached beyond the heavens. They report that they have redeemed over 1,500 people, expending a vast fortune of over 150 real. Now, real, I think I have my plug somewhere. Real is about a month's salary during that time. So if you do the math, you're talking about a tremendous amount of money that's being spent in order to help these people. Where did I put that plug? There we go. Okay. Let's continue. What can they do now for the remaining survivors, the fresh arrivals who are impoverished and in iron chains, suffering under the hands of harsh masters? For the sum of the donations from these places is insufficient for their redemption. And then he continues and he talks about how important it is to raise the money, to put the money together. And incredibly, as I said, they managed to rescue approximately 6,000 of the 10,000 Jews that were captured. 6,000 of them were rescued. Let's just see one more text, text number 14, from a non-Jewish perspective, describing the charity of the Jews in Constantinople and how they're helping these Jews from Poland. So let's see our final text over here, text number 14. Amongst themselves, the Jews are extremely charitable. They take great care of the poor, adding to the price of meat 1 sol per pound. By the end of this year, this makes a large sum, which is used for feeding and supporting the poor, as well as ransoming Jewish slaves whom the Turks and the Tartars take in addition to the Poles. As a result, there are no Jews in the Sultan's galleys apart from those convicted of crimes. So basically, he is testifying that there are no Jewish slaves who are being kept in perpetuity in slavery, but rather they manage to be redeemed by their fellow Jewish brethren. Again, the connection between these communities in terms of a cultural sense is almost non-existent. Different language, different culture, different heritage, different customs. And yet, what binds them together? They're Jews. They're fellow Jews. We have the same Torah. We have a shared history. It is the Torah. It is our Judaism. That's the secret to the unity of our people. We just celebrated Shavuot. And we read that the Jewish people standing at Mount Sinai experienced the ultimate level of unity. Ki ish echad b'lev echad. They stood like one person with one heart. That unity was not just some conceptual unity. It was a unity that was imprinted upon the spirit of the Jewish people that remains with us throughout our history. And that remains with us today as well. And this is very much the spirit that we feel today in the Jewish world. With all the differences of opinion, we feel for each other as brothers and sisters, members of the Jewish community. Okay? So with this, we've concluded our third story. And we've actually concluded our course. And I think it's important to appreciate that we've read stories of strength, stories of bravery, of caring, also horrific stories of persecution. I think one of the things we've explored, we've touched upon in these 4 weeks of Torah study is a reminder of the horrific history that the Jews of Europe went through during these many, many centuries. And the need for a Jewish homeland, for a place where Jews can be safe and protected, was the most obvious thing, and is the most obvious thing to anyone who truly contemplates Jewish history. And to think that it's Europe who are the ones who are at the forefront of shouting that there shouldn't be a homeland for the Jewish people is the most ironic, and the audacity is beyond measure. Okay, let's talk about hostages today. Okay, So in our first story, we were introduced to the idea that it is a tremendous mitzvah to rescue hostages. And we read the incredible events that happened. These rabbis were rescued, they were ransomed, they became leaders of their community. It benefited the entire Jewish world. It seems like a no-brainer. If there's a hostage situation, as we say in Hebrew, b'chol mechir, you pay any price and you go and you rescue people. But then in our second story with Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg, suddenly we're introduced to something else. That you don't give a price more than what is considered reasonable, so to speak. You don't give a ransom more than is reasonable, because then you incentivize additional hostage taking and you impoverish the nation. Okay? And then finally, in our third story, we read about the incredible lengths that the Jewish world went in order to rescue entire communities, thousands and thousands of Jews who were in a very difficult circumstance. Okay, so today again, the Jewish people are dealing with circumstances of hostages. And in many ways, there are similarities. And you hear often quoted and truly quoted, right? It's not misquoted. It's a correct quote, that Judaism keeps the rescue of hostages, holds it up on a pedestal. It's the most important mitzvah. But the question is, are the circumstances the same, or are the circumstances different, based on what we've studied today? And it's interesting. It's not a simple answer. I will, just for the purpose of reference, at the end of the text over here, you have a number of very interesting quotes which you can look at with regards to contemporary hostage situations, where they reference some of these stories that we spoke about today. You can look at it later. But I want to bring up a couple of points, just some of the back and forth, okay? So first of all, it's obviously the biggest mitzvah, for sure. At the same time, Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg said we cannot incentivize. And there are times where you do not redeem hostages because of the ramifications for the Jewish people, like in the case of Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg. Now, by the way, there are some who say Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg was being held for financial ransom. His life was not being threatened. The king was not saying, if you don't pay for him, I'm going to kill him. He died a natural death. He died in prison, but he died a natural death. Perhaps some people say that when a life is in danger, then you pay even more than the person's value. This is one of the arguments that's made for paying anything in a case where hostages are being held by terrorists and their life is in danger every single day. On the other hand, the argument is made, all of those discussions are regarding where the enemies are demanding that you pay money. They're demanding a financial ransom. And obviously in Judaism, if we weigh finances against danger to life takes precedence. In this case, we're not weighing finances against danger to life. There are rabbis who argue. We're weighing danger to life against danger to life, because they're not asking for money. They're asking for the opportunity to massacre more Jews, to commit more October 7th. They want thousands of terrorists released from prison. They want to remain in power with their weapons in order to continue to threaten Israel, right? So in a sense, perhaps the circumstances are different. One thing's for sure. Anyone who gets up and says, it's the most obvious thing, Israel should do A, B, and C. It's not so obvious. It's not so simple. It's very difficult. It's very complicated. And the last thing I would want to be is the one in charge of having to make some of these decisions. One other interesting argument that's made, and I want to bring this up, is this whole idea that Judaism puts danger to life above everything else is not necessarily in a time of war. Let me explain, okay? On a regular day, you wouldn't put someone's life in danger in order to remain in your home. Let's say somebody came over to your house, okay? He knocked on your door, and he said, either you leave your house or I'm going to kill your whole family. What would Judaism tell you to do? Leave the house. It's money versus your life. Life always takes precedence, okay? What if it's a time of war? Sometimes in war, soldiers' lives are put at risk in order to capture a piece of territory. in order literally to capture a house. Why? Because it's not just about the house. This is a war. A war has a purpose. A war has a strategy. A war has a goal, right? And so a lot of the calculations of danger to life versus other things are suspended when it comes to a time of war. And so what many of the halachic authorities have asked regarding today's situation is, obviously soldiers are fighting in a war. What about the hostages? Are they also part of the war? Should they be treated separately than what's going on with the war, or should they be treated as soldiers are treated? Again, these are some of the very, very difficult and complicated questions. One thing is for sure. The Rebbe, over the years, would address some of the hostage negotiations that were going on. This is not the first time that Israel is being asked to ransom innocent people, innocent civilians or soldiers. And the Rebbe would say, these are very, very complicated questions. But one thing's for sure. If Israel would show the proper strength, the proper posture from the beginning, and not giving in to every whim and every demand of the international community, then many of these events wouldn't have happened in the first place. That's for sure. That's for sure. And the reason why Israel should be taking a stronger stance is not for political reasons, but because we put we put preserving human life as the most important thing. We put security as first and foremost. And so there's no question what Israel should do now with the hostages is very, very complicated. And there are no good answers. There are no good answers. Okay? And those who have to make decisions, I pray for them. It's not easy. And of course, we pray for the families and we pray for the hostages themselves. But one thing's for sure. Moving forward, there has to be strength. There has to be absolute clarity that circumstances like this should never be allowed to exist again on Israel's borders. You know, my daughter, Mushka, and her husband were just in Israel, and a friend of theirs, who was an Israeli soldier, who on October 7th went down to the south and was rescuing people, he took them in his car on a tour of the south, and he showed them step by step exactly what happened on that entire on those few days, exactly what they did, what they saw, what they witnessed. And she said to me, there's no question, after you hear the story the way we heard it, it is impossible for Israel to allow this terrorist regime to exist on its borders, armed the way they were before. The world can scream from the rooftops. It can't happen. If Israel wants to exist, this has to change. And God willing, if this changes, then some of these horrific circumstances that we're in now are not going to come up in the future. Let us conclude. There's a beautiful prayer, an important prayer that many synagogues say every single day. This is the prayer on text 16. It's the prayer for the captive. And the prayer was composed about 1,000 years ago, and it's recited in many synagogues. Let's read this together. Prayer for the captives. Text 16 on page 180. Our brethren, the entire Jewish people, who are in distress and captivity, whether on the sea or on dry land, may God have mercy on them and deliver them from distress to relief, from darkness to light, from subjugation to redemption, now, speedily, and soon. And let us say, Amen. Thank you very much for joining us for this incredible journey. We're going to take a little break from JLI for a couple of months. Our next course will pick up after the high holidays. We have 3 amazing courses coming up for next year. Hope you're going to join us, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much. I'll send out a message as soon as I have the topics. Yes, yes, yes.
To grow.
Yes. I'm not sure. But meaning we don't, no, I'll tell you why. We don't have the final ruling, but we have the manuscripts arguing back and forth. So I don't know. It's a good question. Difficult questions, yeah. So let me just close this. 1 second.